good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. I think we have a really interesting panel today, and really excited for everybody to kind of share their viewpoints and thoughts. And Sanjeev, I don't know if you saw your title. It's extremely long, and if you have 3 lines in your title, that means you're a very important person. But can you tell the group a little bit more about kind of your role in the Department of Justice?
Well, thank you so much. They joke that the DC and the DOJ is the home of acronyms, but not for my title. They spell it all out. But thank you for having us. My name is Sanjeev Bhasker. I'm our United States Digital Currency Counsel with our Department of Justice, housed in our Money Laundering and Asset Recovery section, also part of our National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Perry Ann and the group for inviting us. Let me start by just giving a disclaimer for all of us. We are all speaking in our personal capacities and not on behalf of our organizations and or administration. With that being said, the Department of Justice is excited to be here. Let me tell you a little bit about the Digital Currency Initiative and what we're doing. We have a digital currency initiative that was established in 2017 by many of our colleagues and still exists to this date, where we are really focusing on 4 areas in the digital asset specter and sphere, and one being prosecuting cases when it involves digital assets. We prosecute cases, we're federal prosecutors, we're handling investigations involving digital assets and responding to questions, inquiries from the field when it involves victimization involving digital asset crimes. Secondly, we do a lot of training. That's robust training when it comes to what is blockchain technology, what is cryptocurrency, what are zero-knowledge proofs. I like to say we all had that aha moment, I know I did, when we had to figure out what was the Bitcoin, what was the blockchain, how does proof of work consensus work, so on and so on. And we're realizing with humility that we need to continue to train our colleagues, both in industry and law enforcement, both domestically and internationally. The third of our 4 pillars is policy work, and I know that's important to this audience here. We like to be available to consult when it comes to policy, both on the Hill here, domestically and internationally when it comes to the FATF, the MiCA, so on and so on, making sure that we have good policy in place and good regulations in the digital asset arena. And finally, the 4th pillar of the Digital Currency Initiative, again, which I think would be very important to this group, is our private sector engagement. With great support from our administration and department leadership, we've decided that we want to encourage the dialogue with industry when it comes to sharing information, also being able to develop points of contacts to understand who can you contact at the DOJ if you have questions about a certain area, and subsequently, who would we contact at your respective company when it comes to understanding the emerging technologies. And that's part of the reasons you're seeing us at these conferences, engaging with colleagues in the hallway and throughout the kiosks here to make sure we have a healthy dialogue, a healthy partnership with industry when we come into encountering these new areas that are in many ways new to all of us.
So now, Sanjeev, I know the Department of Justice pushed out the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, and we've actually seen some big cases that have come out of that. Can you tell kind of the audience where that kind of plays a role in the Department of Justice?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sid, for that question. The NCET, the NCET, or National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, is something we are very proud of here at the Department of Justice. It was a task force that was created near the end of 2021, comprised of a variety of great prosecutors and colleagues, including members of the Digital Currency Initiative, that are spread throughout the country, U.S. Attorney's offices here at Main Justice, and it was created to tackle the most complex issues involving cryptocurrency, fraud, drug trafficking, ransomware, so on and so on. And we've had a lot of success. Some of the cases have been published. Bislotto was mentioned recently by our colleagues at FinCEN. We, of course, brought charges for unlicensed money transmitting regarding a nefarious crypto exchange based internationally that was helping to launder proceeds for the dark web market Hydra. Additionally, we've seen work from the NCET when it comes to the executive order and digital assets. Of course, those who are familiar would know that last year the administration came out with a declaration that we should develop a variety of reports addressing digital assets in the cryptosphere, and the Department of Justice, with this work with the NCETs, myself and my colleagues included, working collectively, were able to develop reports concerning, 1, how to further strengthen international cooperation when it comes to investigation of digital assets, making sure we have uniform regulations both domestically and abroad, that we don't have judicial arbitrage or safe harbor in other countries while having more stricter regulations in the United States, but having a consistent universal playing field. And additionally, when it comes to law enforcement investigation, both domestically and internationally, of digital assets as a whole. And we'll talk more about that hopefully later this morning, but we've seen a lot of great work with the NCET as we move forth here, continuing to really address and tackle the most complex issues involving cryptocurrency.
Yeah, thanks, Sanjeev. One thing I really like about this panel is not only do we have the Department of Justice, but we've got the White House, we've got the Treasury. So Matt, can you tell us a little bit more about like the national cybersecurity strategy and how that kind of ties in to digital assets?
Yeah, sure, Sid. Great question. So for those of you who are unaware, the White House and the Office of National Cyber Director recently put out the National Cybersecurity Strategy. It essentially lays out the framework for how we will ensure cybersecurity and the United States primacy in emerging technologies, including digital assets, in the future. It's a great read. It's well reviewed. I highly recommend it. But we're a little light on time, so I'm just going to focus on the two big pivot points of the strategy. The second of which is, I think, highly relevant for this group. So the first pivot point is shifting the burden of cybersecurity onto those best able to bear it. To put in layman's terms, it's fundamentally crazy that you could have a massive cyber situation that has national security implications simply because someone, for example, clicked the wrong link at an oil and gas pipeline on the eastern seaboard. That is unacceptable and unsustainable, and our goal is to ensure that does not happen again by implementing this strategy. The second pivot, which again is more relevant to this crowd, is to ensure we invest in the long term towards greater cybersecurity and greater resiliency. Now, what does that mean in the digital assets space? I think one of the things we have to think about going as we make sure that we invest in this technology and ensure the United States primacy in this technology is which founders, which technologists and programmers are putting cybersecurity as a foundational design principle. And those that do will be the ones that succeed, because that issue of security is at the forefront of everyone's mind in the government and now in the private sector as well. What are some areas where digital assets, the founders in this space, the coders, can consider that sort of foundational resiliency? One would be, and it's an issue that's of high importance for our office, is thinking about the sort of coding language you're using. If you're using memory unsafe language, which is the majority of coding used in this space, that creates a shaky foundation for your entire platform that an adversary can exploit. And think back to the old saying, why do people rob banks? Because that's where the money is. You are, I presume, designing platforms where there's going to be a high degree of commerce. And if you design these platforms at a fundamental layer with unsafe coding languages, that creates problems. There's other issues too. If you're creating a decentralized platform, you have to. It's really. By the way, I understand this is really hard. This is coming from someone who has a deep love for the digital assets and blockchain community. So don't take it in a negative way. It's just it's letting you know where we're coming from. So another area to think about is making sure when you're creating these decentralized platforms, you want to think through all the different logical issues that could come up with your smart contracts to avoid getting hit with flash loan scams. And then finally, this may be the least popular, but please hold throwing your vegetables till after the show. It is important for us to think through how we as a society can come together and have both privacy and also accountability. And that means when you're creating your platform, you should think through, how could we have just basic know your customer protocols? I can tell you as someone who has been in classified space in the White House and looked at these sorts of work, again, talking at a very high level, adversaries are looking for platforms where no one can know what they're doing. They take advantage of that. For instance, child pornographers, terrorists, ransomware operators, APT groups. There's public filings all in relation to that. So when you're creating these platforms, you should be thinking through, how can we ensure that the right people are using them to enable commerce, to enable freedom and democracy in a way that is compatible with our fundamental values? And I'm willing to bet, again, we're all speaking in our personal capacity, that the companies and the platforms that do that do the hard work up front, that engage in that resiliency issue, will be the ones that succeed in the coming years.
Yeah, Matt, I think that's an important concept. One thing I think at O'Melveny we see with our clients, with smart contracts, there's always that cybersecurity risk, and I think the importance of you discussing about the coding issues becomes really important on how we address that. Sandra, last but not least, could you tell everybody a little bit about FSOC and the Treasury and kind of your role there?
Sure. Sid, thanks for the question and thanks for having me here today. So the FSOC, otherwise known as the Financial Stability Oversight Council, was established in 2010 under Dodd-Frank. And it's composed of 15 financial regulators, both on the federal and state level. And it includes the alphabet soup of those regulators like the Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, the OCC, just a host of other agencies, and is chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury. I would say that our broader mission is focused on identifying and addressing potential risks to U.S. Financial stability. One of the major ways that we do this is through our convening function, and the various regulators, we all come together to share information, promote coordination, and also do consensus building on the issues that are relevant to us on financial stability.
And so what would be FSOC's role in the cryptocurrency industry for kind of like the private sector to know?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, again, one of our key ways is through our convening function that I just talked about. I would also note that, the FSOC has, if needed, a number of authorities that were granted under Dodd-Frank that it could use to address risk to financial stability. But more specifically, Sanjeev mentioned earlier some of the executive order reports that the U.S. government published last year. So as part of our efforts to, again, convene and collaborate, the FSOC came together to write a report under one of the executive orders on digital assets and financial stability. And in that report, which was very much an interagency effort, and approved unanimously by all the FSOC principals, basically found that digital assets could pose a risk to financial stability if the interconnections with the traditional financial system or their scale were to grow without adherence with appropriate regulation or paired with appropriate regulation. And that, deferring also to my other colleagues in the panel, the importance of enforcement for the appropriate regulation.
No, that's really helpful, Sandra. And so when we're talking about enforcement, I guess, Matt, I'll turn back to you. I guess, what is the White House doing in relation to digital assets?
So there's a... This is where we brag about ourselves for a moment. There is actually a lot of work being done in this space, and actually kind of surprises me how much of it is happening under the radar. I don't think the private sector is fully aware of this. So at this point in time, the White House issued its Digital Assets EO. Since then, the interagency has provided over 9 very substantive reports back to the White House, answering questions in relation to how can we best essentially foster responsible innovation in the digital asset space that is both equitable, ensures our primacy in this area on the world stage, and explores other areas relating to CBDCs, et cetera. So we're extremely busy in this area. One place where I'm personally involved, aside from being some part of some of these reports, including some that Sanjeev had a hand in authoring, is I sit as the digital assets subject matter expert for the Office of National Cyber Director on the Digital Assets R&D Fast Track Action Committee. This is all public-facing information, and yes, it is a very long name. And so for this committee, it has some of the best minds in the public sector, and we invite in some of the greatest minds in the private sector. And we are, every time, multiple times a week, going over extremely important issues relating to digital assets, and as it relates to American commerce, American values, and some strategic decisions we are making in the digital assets space. I can't go into that many details at this time beyond that, but it's important to understand that the White House is very much on top of this issue. The interagency is very focused on this issue, and we are listening to what the private sector has to say, both in this committee and outside of it as well. Your opinion and your expertise very much matters.
Yeah, I think that's really good to know. A lot of times, at least in my head, I think Department of Justice, I think the SEC, I think the CFTC, and I think the Hill. And so it's nice to know, at least from someone at the White House, is able to kind of speak to, having involvement and care about these issues. Sanjeev, I'll kind of turn to you. You're in front of a private sector here. What can we do to, help your role and help the Department of Justice? I know, at least for my side, it's important to get bad actors out of this space because I think it allows the space to grow. It allows the ability to, for cryptocurrency to be more in a lot more households. And so, what can we do in the private sector to help the Department of Justice?
Thank you, Sid, for that question. Let me start by saying our responses from the Department of Justice regarding the executive orders and digital assets was comprised by a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues working at length, and that was very deliberate. We want to make sure the best and brightest are working on this together, including evaluating our relationship with the private industry. And as Sandra mentioned, these executive order reports are public. We have 2 from the DOJ now you can look at, and including what I'm about to mention now regarding the importance of relationship between government and industry. As we noted in our public responses, private sector, private industry is the first line of defense when it comes to identifying violations of law, anti-money laundering issues, notification of ransomware attacks, fraud, so on and so on and so on. The more nefarious, the more important for industry to be involved, observing, learning, and then sharing. It's so important for industry to share with the government, one, so we can protect you and your customers and the constituents involved in the United States. 2, teaching. It's important as well for industry to teach as we teach each other regarding emerging technologies. I mentioned earlier about zero-knowledge proofs, proof of work consensus. We cannot take for granted that everyone knows this, especially when we have the discussion about policy and good policy and legislation. Industry is tasked as well to teach others regarding the fundamentals of these technologies, and that is the reason we are walking these hallways, and we have our colleagues here today working as a whole of government to engage, to learn, to be able to share that knowledge with others within the department and our respective branches when it comes to these areas. And finally, I would say to listen. When there's areas and discussions that Matt and Sandra mentioned regarding compliance and how we can be in compliance with the laws of the land, to be observant of this and to make sure that we have good institutional structures in our companies, in our private sector industry, to have good business in the United States. So I would say share, teach, and listen, but to engage. We value the relationship with the industry. We've been very public about that, and our leadership's been supportive about that because we want to have good compliance in the crypto industry here in the United States and abroad.
So, Sandra, I'd go back to you on that. What can industry do to, make sure their customers are safe and make sure that, blockchain and cryptocurrency in general can grow?
No, so that's a great question and a really important one. And, in our FSOC digital asset report, again, that was published last October, the council identified a series of potential vulnerabilities that both, the public and industry should be guarding for. And, some of those include concerns about operational risk, high leverage, potential run risk associated with the space, and also just concerns about potential liquidity concerns in the event of when some companies provide kind of like bank-like services to in the digital asset ecosystem. So there are just some, again, vulnerabilities and risks that we ask lawmakers, the public, industry to be thoughtful about. I would say more broadly, the report also talks about the importance of the industry and the ecosystem to continue to adhere to regulations. There's a large swath of the digital asset ecosystem that is already addressed and covered by the current regulatory framework. I would note more recently, some of the council members have put out essentially some guidance. So I know the SEC has a proposed rule out talking about investment advisors and custody. And more recently, over the past number of months, some of the FSOC banking regulators have put out statements on firms that provide services to crypto companies. So I think, I agree with some of the sentiments shared earlier on this panel. The council does believe in the importance of innovation, but also the need, I think, to balance that, whether or not, for public safety, but also financial stability. And so the importance of all those factors are critical.
Sandra, you said the FSOC report came out in October?
It did.
It did, okay. So FTX was shortly after that, I'm assuming.
Yes, it did. So again, our report was very much an interagency effort, and We did, I mean, this is part of our job. It's a little bit of herding cats sometimes, but bringing together the insights of the banking regulators, securities regulators, commodities, et cetera. We really did pull together to identify risks, and a number of those issues did come to pass, unfortunately, I think with FTX, which occurred soon after the publication of our report.
And Sanjeev, I'll come back to you. Matt had mentioned the White House, I guess the executive order on digital assets. I think you guys had a response to that, right? Can you talk to the group a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. As I mentioned earlier, we had two specific responses from the Department of Justice when it came to the executive order on digital assets. One involved international cooperation and international investigations involving digital assets that we released in July of last year, June or July of 2022, and then a subsequent report involving a law enforcement investigation of digital assets, and later in September of 2022. Briefly, both reports, again being public, summarize not only the lay of the land when it comes to what we're observing internationally and domestically in these areas, but also recommendations for the public and for the White House and the administration, and really for crypto as a whole when it comes to the conclusions made in these reports. And I'll mention a couple brief ones. When it comes to the international development of law enforcement and prosecutions, the importance of uniform regulation both domestically and abroad. We do not want to have arbitrage, judicial arbitrage, where laws are differently abroad, where companies can have safe harbor and establish abroad and avoid the regulations being imposed on law-abiding companies domestically in the United States and abroad for that matter. When it comes to the secondary report regarding the role of law enforcement in investigating and prosecuting crimes, again, I come back to the importance of the relationship between government and industry, the importance of working with the private sector to develop ongoing dialogue. I'll mention a couple of the opportunities because people often ask, they'll say, Sanjeev, Matt, Sandra, well, where are the opportunities for us to do this? We see SEC's developed FinHub, CFTC is our Office of Technology and Innovation, FinCEN, our great colleagues that already spoke today, have their FinCEN exchanges, so on and so on. So when we look in the environment here, we can see a lot of opportunities for industry to engage and have that dialogue and be able to really be on the front line of making sure we have good policy, good industry, good technology that's better for business and better for the society as a large. And again, these discussions, these dialogues are fleshed out in much more detail in our public DOJ reports, which are able to look online.
And so, Sanjeev, when you go out and do these types of outreaches, are you there as well, and you're interacting with everybody and kind of allowing individuals to really address some of these issues with the department?
Yeah, my colleagues as well. Again, I'm just one part of a team. I want to reiterate that. We're definitely a team. I'm just one person. I'm blessed and honored to be here. But there's a team behind the DOJ working and addressing these areas. And with the support of our administration and leadership, we've decided to go and engage with industry to learn. And I mentioned, we're listening as well. So when there's issues, in fact, already this morning, two gentlemen have approached me with issues, questions they've had about technology and understanding how certain things fit within the parameters of our law. We have these discussions and we learn from you, and then we reiterate the fact that we're learning too as well. And I think additionally I'll mention the importance for points of contacts. If you're an industry and you're established, and let's say you're a decentralized finance aggregator but you have a general counsel there, we want to know who the individual is so we can have dialogue with you back and forth. And that's so important too when it comes to emerging technologies, that we have direct points of contacts in the variety of industries in front of us today to make sure the dialogue continues after today. When April comes, when May comes, so on and so on, we can continue to dialogue and talking and speaking. And that, again, is part of the reason myself and my colleagues will go out and have these engagements.
And so we're almost coming at the end of time, but I'd ask that same question to Matt and Sandra. But what are some of the outreach that you guys are doing within your agency, and do you find that important?
Want to go first?
Yeah, Sandra.
I can keep it short. I mean, I think, in the process of writing our digital assets and financial stability report, we did basically roundtable outreach to a number of constituents, both in industry and academia, nonprofits, folks in the technology sector. We found that outreach incredibly important and helpful as we were pulling together the report. I would just say more broadly across the work we do with the FSOC, maybe just taking a quick step back, in addition to digital assets, we're also very focused on climate-related financial risk, non-bank financial intermediation, and Treasury market resiliency. And I would say for this crowd on digital assets and more broadly, my team, my colleagues at the FSOC are very interested in engaging with industry and other key stakeholders to listen and learn.
Matt, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So the way that we tend to engage in outreach from the White House is in these sorts of events. We have an opportunity to speak with you both on the stage now and hopefully afterwards. And the message that we provide in this is, I guess, the similar one we give right now, is that at the end of the day, what you're doing is important. And on a higher strategic level, we are all in this together. Everyone in this room, everyone in the private sector, and everyone in the public sector. So right now, we are in the midst of a broader contest along many different lines. One of them is in relation to blockchain technology and digital assets. The goal for the White House, the goal ultimately for the American people, is that when this technology hits prime time, hits mass adoption, when it goes across the world, it is adopted in a way that is consistent with fundamental human values, fundamental human rights, and the way that we see ourselves as Americans furthering those rights. That includes privacy, that includes accountability. And I think when I say these words, I imagine there are a number of folks in the audience who think, well, maybe, but I disagree with him about this or that, or I think this and I'm a privacy maximalist, what have you. Granted, I understand that. But sometimes what can help you see the true distinction between what matters is to look at a strong contrast. So right now, we are all ultimately working on a relatively similar path where we're all trying to develop, I submit. But there are other groups, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party and the digital yuan, that offers a worldview of how digital assets should work that is fundamentally different than I would wager everyone in this room would want. A system where the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government would have absolute control, absolute transparency over seeing everything happens in the blockchain, the right to pull at any point any money they want, the right to freeze transactions. And they're right now trying to export that sort of technology, in particular, to the global south. So while we may have some disagreements in the margins, fundamentally, we are in this together to ensure the next century, in terms of financial transactions, use of blockchain in other contexts, is in a way that is, again, shows America is a leader in this space, but also, more importantly, is in accord with our fundamental values. And we should be working on that as one.
Well, thanks so much, Matt, and Sanjeev and Sandra, thank you so much for being here. I think everybody really appreciated your talk. Thanks.